Have you ever imagined being forced into a loveless marriage? Believing that happiness would never knock on your door, and then, right in the middle of that darkness, finding a love that would turn your life upside down? It seems impossible, doesn't it? But that's exactly the story I'm about to share with you. A journey marked by disappointments, unexpected twists and turns, and an ending that no one could have predicted. Stay with me until the end, because this is one of those stories that can change your heart, and maybe even your idea of what love really is. The deal that changed my life. My name is Clara, and I never planned on getting married, especially not to Leonardo, a man I barely knew, but who would end up rewriting the story of my life. But before I continue, answer me this. Do you believe that true love can blossom after saying I do? Even when that I do was said out of duty, not desire. Tell me in the comments. I want to hear from you because this story will touch your soul. When I agreed to marry Leonardo, it wasn't out of love or even hope. It was out of desperation. My family's business was hanging by a thread, and my mother, she was drowning in debt and sleepless nights. Then came the proposal, a trap disguised as salvation. And like all traps, it seemed simple at first. Leonardo was the son of my father's business partner.
Rich, handsome,
Arrogant. The kind of man who looks at you like someone inspecting a used car, calculating, distant, cold. My heart, still bleeding from a love that never loved me back, froze the moment I was told I had been chosen. I was the bargaining chip, the price for mistakes that weren't even mine. The wedding was rushed. No flowers, no dreams, no soul. Just a rented dress and an empty echo in my chest. I still feel the bitter taste of that moment when I said, "Yes, I do." But something unexpected happened. At that very moment, something inside him changed too. I didn't know it yet, but Leonardo, who seemed so distant, so unreachable, was carrying his own battles, his own scars. He wasn't there just for pride or profit. He had his reasons, and they were heavier than I could have imagined. If you've ever felt trapped in a choice you never wanted to make, don't walk away now. Because what's to come will prove that even from the ruins, something sacred can still be born. And if this story is already awakening something in you, comment now. Do you believe that love can be built after marriage? Your voice may inspire someone out there, another woman facing the same storm. The first few days in that house felt frozen. The silence was heavy, almost as if the air was pressing against my chest. Everything around me was immaculate. Too perfect. Too cold. It was all marble and chandeliers, but no warmth. No laughter. No life. Leonardo would wake up before dawn, and always leave when I came downstairs. Sometimes he would leave his coffee cup on the table, like a ghostly trail that said, "I was here." But he never expected it. That kitchen, though grand, felt like a palace of solitude, so different from the humble warmth of my childhood home, where the smell of coffee meant someone loved you. At lunch, the food was served in silence by a waitress who barely looked me in the eye. And during dinner, the scene repeated itself. He sat on the other side of the table, focused on his food or on any subject that did not involve me. The sound of the television playing in the background was nothing more than a shield, meant to drown out the noise of our silence. But that wasn't the part that hurt me the most. What broke me was knowing that I was married to a man who didn't know me, and didn't even try, realizing that, even as his wife, I was just a convenient presence, a name on paper, a forced signature on a certificate. At night, we retreated to separate rooms. His was at the end of the hallway, mine was closer to the stairs. And there, in my corner, I lay on an expensive pillow soaked in tears. I cried silently, stifled sobs, and hid even from myself. I kept asking myself what I had done to deserve so much loneliness wrapped in someone else's last name. But then, one stormy night, everything began to shift. The lights flickered. The wind slammed against the windows. And I had a breakdown, not because of the storm. I had weathered worse, but from suffocation.
anxiety.
The weight of silent anguish that had built up for too long. I curled up on the floor, heart racing, breath short. I tried to hold it in, but I couldn't anymore. It felt like something inside me was about to shatter. Then I heard the door slowly open. It was Miguel. He didn't say a word, just walked in and looked at me with eyes I'd never seen before. Eyes with no armor, no judgment. Eyes that recognized pain, perhaps because they had known it too. He knelt beside me and placed a glass of water in my trembling hands.
Stayed there. Quiet.
He didn't touch me, didn't ask questions,
Just kept me company.
and in that silence, there was an unexpected tenderness. A gesture of humanity that unraveled me more than any words could. The next morning, the routine resumed, but something had changed. On the breakfast table, beside the bread and butter, there was a flower. Simple. Picked from the garden. No note. No explanation. Just a gesture. And that gesture cracked open my locked heart, just a little. That week, subtle details began to appear. Miguel waited for me to sit before starting his meals. One day, he asked whether I preferred tea or coffee, as if that mattered. But it did, because it was the first time he'd shown interest in knowing something about me. We started exchanging discreet glances. Miguel was still reserved, almost an enigma, but something in him had shifted. A quiet care, a respectful distance. As if he were trying, in his own silent way, to apologize, not with words, but with small actions. I realized that, like me, he carried wounds he never showed. Old scars, long-kept traumas he probably never shared. He was a man who had learned to silence his emotions, to harden his face in order to protect what remained of his heart. And maybe that's why he always kept his distance. Because to love, especially after suffering, is to risk again. It means taking off the armor. And he clearly didn't know how to do that yet. But in that once hostile environment, something new began to bloom. Still fragile.
Still shy.
But real. A kind of affection that grows in unexpected places. We were 2 steps forward and 10 steps back, but at least, now, we were walking in the same direction. The conversations were still few. But the silences were no longer empty. They were shared. And so, without haste, without promises, without expectations, a love began to whisper its name. Not in cinematic fashion, like the made-up romances, but in the most beautiful and real way, with kindness, respect, and above all, patience. At lunch, the food was served in silence by a maid who never looked me in the eyes. At dinner, it was the same. Leonardo sat across from me, eyes fixed on his plate or on something distant, as if my presence didn't exist. The soft hum of the television filled the air, not for entertainment, but as a shield against the heavy silence between us. But that wasn't what hurt the most. What broke me was being married to a man who didn't know me, and worse, didn't care to try. Being his wife felt more like a role than a reality, like I was just a name on a contract, a necessary signature to seal a deal. At night, we went to separate bedrooms. His was at the end of the corridor. Mine was closer to the stairs. And there, in the solitude of a luxurious bed, I cried. Not loud, not dramatic, just quietly, into a pillow that soaked up the pain. I didn't dare speak. I asked myself, again and again, what I had done to deserve such an empty kind of love, if you could even call it that. Then came the storm. One night, the sky raged. The wind howled against the windows, and lightning cut through the dark like an omen. But I didn't break because of the storm outside. I broke because of the one within. My breath turned shallow, my chest heavy. Anxiety clawed at me, and I slid down to the floor, knees pulled to my chest, unable to stop the tears. That's when the door opened.
Slowly. Carefully.
It was Leonardo. He didn't speak. He just came in, knelt beside me, and placed a glass of water in my trembling hands. He didn't touch me.
Didn't ask why.
He simply stayed. His presence, quiet, grounded, felt like an anchor in my chaos. In his eyes, I saw something unfamiliar. Not coldness, not distance, but a quiet ache, as if somehow he recognized my pain because he had lived it too. The next morning, nothing was said about the night before, but on the breakfast table, beside the buttered toast, there was a single garden flower. No note, No explanation. Just a gesture. A whisper of something I didn't know he was capable of. That week, something began to shift. Leonardo waited for me to sit before he began his meals. One evening, he asked whether I preferred tea or coffee, as if my preferences mattered. But they did. Because that was the first time he had looked beyond the surface of me. Our eyes met more often.
Briefly. Carefully.
Leonardo was still guarded, still a mystery I couldn't solve. But now there was a softness in him, hidden beneath the armor. A quiet apology in the way he opened a door, or paused before turning away. Not with words, but with presence. I started to see it. He, too, was a soul marked by silence. A man who had loved and lost. Who had learned to survive by building walls instead of bridges. He was afraid. Not of me, but of what I represented. The risk of feeling again. And maybe I was too. But in that once cold mansion, something fragile began to bloom. Not passion. Not fire.
But something more sacred.
Respect. Kindness. A rhythm that was ours alone. We weren't rushing. We weren't promising anything. But we were walking toward each other, slowly, vulnerably. The words were still few. But the silence was no longer empty. And in that silence, something unspoken began to grow. Not a fairy tale, but maybe finally a beginning. And that was what made me want to stay. It was love, growing slowly but with deep roots. The days that followed that night changed everything, even if the words between us were still few. The house, once filled with distance and formality, began to carry a new energy, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet impossible to ignore. Leonardo, who once seemed cold and unreachable, started waiting for me when I returned from the flower shop. His gaze was a little softer, his posture slightly more relaxed, as if something inside him was beginning to open. As for me, Clara, I had always kept an invisible wall around my heart to protect myself, but I started to notice the little things I had once ignored. The light scent of lavender on his shirt, the way he adjusted his collar before leaving for work, the strength in his hands that seemed to carry untold stories, and a quiet sadness in his eyes that spoke louder than any words. One night, everything began to change for real. I walked into the living room and saw a cup of hot tea beside my favorite book, carefully placed on the table. No note, no explanation, just that silent, simple gesture that spoke volumes. He had chosen to do something for me, without asking for anything in return, just to show he cared. I wrapped my hands around the cup, letting its warmth sink deeper than just my skin. For the first time, silence didn't feel heavy, but comforting, a space where we could both exist without fear or hurry. It was an invitation, an unspoken connection neither of us dared to name, yet it had already begun to bloom. The following days were filled with small, invisible details that meant the world to us. Leonardo noticed how I tied my hair when I was nervous, a simple gesture hiding deep insecurities. And I, in turn, noticed how he furrowed his brow when he was lost in thought, a sure sign of storms stirring within him. Those small observations built an invisible thread between us, weaving a web of care and silent understanding that replaced the emptiness that once ruled the house. The home, once cold and indifferent, started to breathe. The flowers on the porch, once wilted, were now blooming with color, reflecting the transformation that no one could see, but we could feel. The scent of morning coffee carried a new flavor, the flavor of hope. Even the timid conversations felt different, soaked in a tenderness that surprised us both. They weren't just words filling the air, but fragile attempts to build something together. Even if we didn't know what that something would become. I had sworn never to let myself fall in love like this. And yet, I began to dream of staying, of building a life with him, despite the fear still clinging to my chest. Leonardo, who had sealed his heart shut after too many past wounds, slowly started to hope that I would stay, not just under his roof, but truly in his life. It was as if the silence that once kept us apart had become the bridge that finally brought us closer. And without realizing it, we were both letting the impossible take root, allowing a fragile but very real hope to grow between us. Time found a new rhythm within our walls, slow and gentle. Each moment became meaningful. The walls that had once kept us guarded now seemed to soften. The cold house began to feel like a home. Leonardo, who used to carry himself with distant resolve, now gave himself away in subtle gestures, a faint smile, a lingering glance, a presence that stayed close, even in silence. And I, Clara, who had always guarded my heart like a sacred treasure, began to realize that life had a way of surprising us, that love could bloom in the most unexpected places. The routine that once felt like a burden now carried hints of tenderness. We started sharing moments, a slow-brewed cup of coffee, glances exchanged as he read the newspaper, the kind of silence only possible between two people just beginning to truly see each other. These moments, small as they were, held tremendous weight. Each gesture felt like a brick in the foundation of something we were too afraid to name, but couldn't stop building. My heart began to race when he was near, not out of fear or duty, but from something else, something like belonging. He, too, started to express his care through daily gestures, though words still came with difficulty. And in those small, quiet offerings, he let down the mask that had protected him for so long and let me glimpse the soul behind it, tired, but full of hope. It wasn't easy. The ghosts of the past still lingered. Insecurities still whispered during quiet moments. Fear of getting hurt again haunted us both.
But still, we kept going.
Step by step, gesture by gesture. We were building something fragile, but honest. Something imperfect, but deeply real. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was life, raw and unpolished, but somehow even more beautiful. That house, once home to silence and sorrow, began to transform into a place where something sacred stirred. A love that didn't need grand declarations to be felt. A love that showed itself in the ordinary, in the imperfect, in the real. And even though neither of us knew where that road would lead, we both knew one thing for sure.
Something had changed.
Forever. The silence that night was different. Not the silence of avoidance or distance, but a sacred kind of quiet. A stillness where the heart could breathe. We sat there, side by side, not saying anything because we didn't need to. What we felt was already there, in the air between us, in the accidental brush of hands, in the rhythm of our breaths. It was a silent promise that despite everything, it was worth it. Leonardo felt something new awakening inside him, something he could no longer deny or push away. A feeling that didn't ask for permission, that simply existed. And I felt it too. A desire to stop looking backward, and to start imagining what might still be possible, even if we had to build it one moment at a time. Something unseen connected us. A delicate thread, invisible but unbreakable, pulling us closer, defying all doubt, daring us to believe. That marriage, which had once seemed like a punishment, slowly began to transform into a space where an uncertain seed of hope tried to blossom. I felt like we were in unfamiliar territory, both insecure, both trying to learn how to get closer. Behind the cold walls of that house, a small light had begun to shine. But it wasn't easy. There were countless moments of conflict, of piercing silence, of a distance that seemed insurmountable. I wondered if that change was real or just a passing illusion, a way of hiding what could never truly be. And what about him? Did Leonardo really want to open his heart? Or was I simply fooling myself? What I didn't expect was that, little by little, his resistance began to disappear. Our conversations began to flow, still hesitant, still full of pauses, but they were real. He shared fragments of his life with me, stories that felt heavy on his chest, secrets that had been kept for years that were now beginning to emerge. I listened carefully, trying to absorb every word, because at that moment I realized that we were building something delicate, a bridge connecting our very different worlds. And even amid the doubts and fears, I felt an invisible force pulling us closer, a silent invitation to leave the pain behind and allow ourselves to try. Deep down, I knew that this marriage, which had begun so bitterly, could become the start of a story no one would believe, but one I was willing to live. Love, when it blooms from where you least expect, defies every certainty, shatters our plans, and invites us to discover who we truly are. And I, even without knowing what the future held, decided it was worth the risk. Because sometimes, it's within imperfection that love finds its way. Since that day, when everything changed, I started to notice little things I had never seen before. The way Leonardo looked at me, sometimes without realizing. The silence between us, which slowly became more comfortable. It wasn't just about the missing words, but about the feeling that began to grow, slowly, without hurry. I felt confused, because what once felt like a punishment now had a different taste. It was strange but also new. As if, amid the chaos, something uncontrollable was being born. Something that made me hope not for what I wanted, but for what was beginning to feel possible. One morning, he appeared with a cup of coffee, something so simple, yet to me, it felt like an unexpected gift. We sat in the kitchen, the soft sunlight streaming through the window, and for the first time, there were no uncomfortable silences. He spoke about everyday things, childhood memories, even laughed at a silly joke. That moment seemed ordinary, but to us, it was a quiet revolution. I began to realize that, despite all the struggles and resentment we carried, there was a genuine desire to meet each other halfway. He didn't need to say he cared. I could see it in the way he adjusted the blanket over me on cold nights, in how he waited for me when I came home, or in the way he looked at me, shy but filled with something I was still trying to understand. But of course, not everything was perfect. Insecurities still lived between us, as did the fear of what others might think, of the judgment that surrounded us. After all, we were two people thrown into a situation without choice, and the world around us refused to understand what was unfolding inside that house. Sometimes, words became weapons, and silence, a shield to hide our vulnerability. Even I questioned whether I was ready for such surrender, whether I could truly open my heart to someone who, until recently, was almost a stranger. And him. Did Leonardo believe he deserved a chance? Or was he simply drifting with fate, without genuine hope? Despite all those doubts, something kept me there. The certainty that, beneath the pain and fear, there was still a path toward love. A love that wasn't born of instant enchantment, but of slow construction, of patience, of daily understanding. And that certainty, though fragile, gave me the strength to keep going, to believe that this story could be ours. Everyday life didn't change overnight, of course. There were still tensions, wary glances, moments when I wanted to run from it all. But Leonardo also began to show other sides, the ones the world never saw. I saw a man fighting his own demons, and that touched me more deeply than I expected. It was as if, in the middle of this forced marriage, we were both rediscovering ourselves, finding strength we never knew we had. And without realizing it, I started to long not just for the end of pain, but for the beginning of something that could truly be worth it. That small gesture of care marked the beginning of a series of changes I hadn't seen coming. Slowly, he began to reveal shades of himself that had long been hidden behind a hard, closed-off posture. I realized that the barriers between us weren't just physical, but deeply emotional.
Fear,
Hurt.
pride.
And as those walls began to fall, not all at once, but in quiet pieces, we both started to transform. I, who had once lived in a near-automatic mode, lost between duties and silence, began to allow myself small moments of surrender. It wasn't a sweeping love, the kind that explodes and turns everything into a storm, but something gentler. A quiet change that showed itself in gestures, in unexpected smiles, in a real desire to understand and be understood. Leonardo, in turn, showed me that there was more than just the cold exterior I had known. Each time he surprised me with kindness, with a gentle word, I realized that behind that rigid man was a human being who, like me, longed to be accepted, loved, and respected. I saw his gaze soften, his voice lose its sharp edge and gain a tenderness I never would have imagined. But what surprised me the most was realizing that our transformations were connected, one fed the other. The love that once seemed non-existent revealed itself in small acts. The breakfast he made without me asking, the worried glance when I felt down, the hand that, shyly, reached for mine in the dark of night. It was as if we were discovering together that love doesn't have to be perfect to be real. This discovery, however, didn't erase the wounds we still carried. There were moments when insecurity took over, when the past tried to pull us backward, into fear and doubt. But it was in those moments that I learned the value of patience and perseverance, not just with him, but with myself. I understood that love isn't a static feeling. It's made of daily choices, of letting go of pride, of accepting the other's flaws, and most importantly, recognizing our own limitations. And Leonardo, too, learned that to earn my trust, he had to be sincere, vulnerable, and willing to let his walls fall. Along this journey, I realized we weren't just changing one another. We were discovering who we truly were, rewriting our stories in a new direction. The marriage that had started as an obligation, a disguised prison, began to reveal a new reality, the possibility of a genuine love, even one born amid chaos. It was a slow process, sometimes painful, but filled with hope. And I started to believe that even under the most unlikely circumstances, love can blossom and transform lives in ways we never imagined. As the days passed, something changed inside me. Clara always believed that love was a delicate dance between trust and total surrender. When Leonardo entered her life, he seemed like a whirlwind, a charming, intense man, but shrouded in shadows that no one dared to unravel. Even so, Clara felt immediately drawn to him, as if an invisible magnet pulled her heart closer to that mystery. Leonardo had a look that spoke more than words, a silence filled with untold stories. From their first meeting, there was an electricity between them that promised worlds and, at the same time, hid deep secrets. Clara knew that there was something more behind that restrained smile, an enigma that he guarded tooth and nail. As the days turned into nights of whispered conversations and hesitant touches, Clara found herself diving deeper into Leonardo's universe. Little by little, she discovered fragments of a life marked by difficult choices, painful betrayals, and promises made in the dark. Each discovery was like a piece of a puzzle that she didn't know if she wanted to put together, but that she felt she needed to understand. However, Clara was not a woman who backed down from the unknown. Her love grew along with her courage, and she decided to face the shadows that surrounded Leonardo. Not with fear, but with the strength that only a passionate heart possesses. The decisive moment did not come with confrontations or tears, but with an unexpected revelation, a truth that transformed pain into hope. What Leonardo held was not a prison, but a bridge to freedom, an invitation to rewrite together the destiny that seemed set before they met. In the silence of that night, Clara and Leonardo stood side by side, hand in hand, ready to write a new chapter. A chapter where the past ceased to be a shadow and the future shone with the light of trust and true love. But destiny, always full of surprises, had another twist in store for the story. At dusk, Clara walked alone to the cliff where, months ago, Leonardo had whispered promises to the wind. As she reached into her pocket, she felt the cold paper of a letter left for her. The handwriting was his, unmistakable, but the content did not bring sadness. It brought a call. Leonardo had not disappeared. On the contrary, he chose to step away to protect Clara and everything they had built. His absence was not abandonment, but a silent sacrifice so that she could live, grow, and keep alive the love that united them. In that letter, Leonardo entrusted Clara with a mission, not of resignation, but of guardian of a love that knew no limits. A love capable of overcoming time, distance, and silence. With a heavy heart and a newfound determination, Clara turned to the horizon, feeling that she was now the protagonist of a greater story. A story where love did not need perfect endings, but rather eternal legacies. And so, under the sky that was tinged with stars, Clara made her promise to honor that love, to guard it with the strength of 1,000 lives, and to show the world that the greatest romances are those that transform into eternity. Have you ever wondered if true love can be born from the most unexpected obligations and challenges? If you believe there is a secret word capable of transforming any relationship, leave hope in the comments and come discover with me how this force changes lives. Subscribe now and don't miss any chapter of this passion that defies all rules.